Hello, and welcome to the Beyond Borders podcast, the podcast that explores topics related to international trade. This podcast is brought to you by Buckland. For over 70 years, Buckland has been working to help companies across the world experience global trade in a better way. As a customer-focused company, we provide you with a single source of unmatched customs brokerage, trade managed solutions, freight forwarding, trade technologies, and warehousing and distribution services. I'm your host, Jenny Kaus, Corporate Marketing Manager at Buckland, and today we will be sharing the audio from our recent live webinar on anti-dumping and countervailing duties. The presenter on our webinar was Chris Borganis, and he's the Manager of Compliance and Consulting here at Buckland. Chris is a licensed customs broker, and he holds his Certified Customs Specialist designation. Chris has been with Buckland for 4 years and focuses on classification and specializes in OEM automotive, HVAC systems, aftermarket machinery, and testing apparatuses. I hope you'll enjoy listening in to this podcast today.
Thank you, Jenny, and thank you everyone else for joining. It's my pleasure to be here today and kind of walk through this difficult and complicated topic with you. So, where to start? Where to start with this, complicated topic? I'm going to start with just some general definitions of what is dumping and what is anti-dumping duties. Dumping itself is when a company exports a product to another country and then sells it for less than fair market value. That could be that you're exporting it at an unprofitable price, or it could be that you're selling it, less than what you sell it for domestically with your own company. Anti-dumping duty, collectively known or colloquially known as AD or ADD, amounts to a punishment for when companies are doing this abroad. And so the next kind of question is, why would companies engage in dumping? If you think about what I said, one example is that when companies export something and sell it unprofitably abroad. The thought is that if companies sell these items cheaper, so sell their products cheaper than it costs them to make them abroad, they could drive out competition or gain an increased market share. And once their market share has been maximized or their competition eliminated, they could raise their prices and then truly see profit. Anti-dumping duty is the tariff that stops this. So if something is found to be dumping, anti-dumping duty is to keep foreign customers from selling unfairly here in the United States or in Canada. And one example, anti-dumping is calculated by company. So these are issued on a company by company basis. While there's often ranges in implications for other producers of that item in the same country, dumping is issued by company itself. So next, what is countervailing duties? Countervailing duties, known as CVD, are an attempt to disrupt via another type of advantage. Countervailing duties are issued when a country provides manufacturers who export abroad a subsidy or some other form of assistance that gives them an unfair advantage. While subsidy is, easy to define, right? So subsidy is quite simply exporting at, unfair prices based on your domestic prices. That unfair advantage is a much more vague term. So examples of that unfair advantage would be, preferential tax incentives, preferential loan rates for exporters, or different grants and different forms of funding being granted to exporters by the country that they are being exported from. So today we're primarily going to talk about anti-dumping and countervailing duties as it relates to the United States. But I did want to briefly touch on Canada. Canada and the U.S., while they differ, they have similar protectionary methods in place. In Canada, it's called SEMA, which stands for the Special Import Measures Act. SEMA is overseen by CBSA and the Canadian International Trade Tribunal. They tag team that. And for those interested in SEMA, there's a couple links that I've placed on this slide. The main one is an overview to the SEMA process in Canada, which includes some Canadian-centric definitions, although most of what I'm going over today would apply for both. The second is the current measures in force in place in Canada, meaning this is the open cases that are currently enacted in Canada. Canada has much fewer cases enacted than the United States at this time. But if you have any specific questions about SEMA, about specific cases relating to your company, et cetera, please reach out to myself or CSA@buckland.com following this webinar, and we'll be happy to work with you on that itself. All right. So next, I kind of wanted to walk through a few examples of AD and CVD. I'm trying to give some clear-cut examples here. So the first would be anti-dumping. If company A major suppliers of screws, decides to expand into the U.S., at home in China, their screws are 4 cents a screw. In the U.S., they market their product at 1 cent a screw, meaning it would be 3 cents less than in their domestic market. And we know it costs them 2 cents to make each screw. This would be a clear-cut example of dumping. This company is taking a loss for every screw it sells in the U.S. They are essentially undercutting the U.S. Producers of screws. And both U.S. and Canada would take action if a scenario like this played out. In terms of an example of countervailing duties, if company B, a supplier of bolts, decided to expand from China to the United States, at home their bolts are 3 cents. In the U.S., they market their bolts at 4 cents, meaning it's more than what they were marketing them for at home. And then in the U.S., once they get to the U.S., the Chinese government gives them 2 cents per bolt in the form of a subsidy. So while the price in this example would be more than the domestic price, this would be countervailing duties because there's 2 cent subsidy given on each bolt. Now, these two examples were clear-cut examples of AD and CVD, but sometimes it's not quite so clear, or sometimes it's not just one, it would be both. If we look at, the example of the bolts for countervailing duties, if they sold them at, they marketed them, let's say, at 1 cent a bolt in the United States, this would then, be a case of both anti-dumping and CVD. Additionally, like I talked about, there's other levels of assistance that would, be considered a subsidy or assistance for exporters. So if, for example, to expand to the United States, company B needed a loan and the Chinese government's bank decided to give them an interest-free loan, pardon me. If they got an interest-free loan to do this expansion, that would be a different form of assistance. So equally important about what is AD and CVD, it's what isn't. So one thing I wanted to talk about is a comparative advantage is not dumping. So I know I'm asking us all a lot to think back to our economics classes all those years ago. But one example I have here is that if company C, a major supplier of t-shirts in China, decides to expand to the U.S., so in China, their shirts are $4 a shirt. It costs them $2 to make each shirt. And then in the U.S., they sell them for $5 a shirt. Even if the largest U.S. manufacturer of t-shirts sells their items at $6, which is more expensive, in this case, this Chinese company would just have a clear comparative advantage in the production of t-shirts. So this would not be a dumping instance. And this, would eventually be struck down in the process. When we look at what isn't countervailing duties, one example would be as if company B, a supplier of lamps, expanded to the United States. In China, their lamps were $3, and in the U.S., they marketed them for $4. So they would need, if they needed to take a loan to expand into the U.S., and they took a loan from a state-owned bank in China. So as opposed to the example of assistance above, where it was a interest-free loan, if this loan had the same interest rate as a loan that Bank of America or Chase or any other major lender, offers, this would not be a case of, assisting their company because the bank's in for profit as well. So if there was the loan at the same rate, it would not be a case of CVD. So, how many of us first hear that our products are covered by anti-dumping or countervailing duties is when our brokers attempt to file an entry and the HTS code that you're using has flagged based on HTS code and country of origin. So while anti-dumping and countervailing duties cases are by product types, companies, and or countries, each case is also related to potential HS codes. Now, one thing I want to note is that these HS codes are guidelines, meaning just because an item is flagged for a specific HTS code, it does not mean that that item necessarily applies to the cases at hand. What it means is that if an item flags, an investigation will be needed on the scope of the case and on the product itself. As an example, if a pipe fittings HS code flagged due to a tariff, the case that it flagged for might only apply for seamless pipes, or it might only apply for pipes with a certain level of carbon included. So while those flags would have taken place for any pipe with that tariff, it's the importer's job to look at the case and to see if your particular product applies. If a mid-size importer paid AED or CVD on every product that flagged without ruling out non-applicable items, they could quickly pay millions or billions of extra duties a year that they would not need to pay. So it's really important that while you can use the HTS flag, it's important to also investigate the cases itself. Now, I'm going to go into that investigation process a little bit later. But first, either way, the next question is how to proactively tell if your items are flagged. So once they're flagged, either at the time of the entry by your broker, or if you proactively work them, the result will be the same investigation, which I'll go into. But most of us, are trying to have the best compliance programs possible, and we want to tell if an item flags beforehand. So while cases are for particular countries and particular companies, and descriptions, which the descriptions have the proxy of HTS, there's a couple ways to start this process. And there's a couple, pluses and minuses with each approach, but essentially the approaches are to start with country of origin and eliminate your product lines, via the country that you purchased them from, or to start with the HTS. Now, if you start with country of origin, it's going to be a less precise process, and it will require a larger understanding of the cases involved, as well as an understanding of all your product lines from those countries. If you start with the HTS and the items that will quote unquote flagged by HTS code, it will require you to classify your products in advance, which is, while a good practice, it's a difficult practice. And it also is going to require you to look, at quite all of your items. So, while there's pluses and minuses to each approach, basically depending on how your program looks, you're going to want to choose or be able to choose one of these two options. So as a kind of clear-cut example, if you only import, one product from another country, let's say that you import one item from Chile, it's much easier to look through the items that have ADD and CVD from Chile and to see if they apply than to, look through HTS codes of every item. When we look at Chile, there's one case for Chile and it's for preserved mushrooms. Most of us could quickly rule that out. However, if you import, items from 15 to 20 countries, and some of those countries are, China, for example, has quite a few cases, or countries in Southeast Asia, and even Mexico has quite a few cases. If you have imports from these countries, it's likely much easier to look by HTS and then to periodically review the cases in the countries to watch out for new cases and new product lines covered. So, in the example of, proactively telling by country of origin, the best place to start would be a web link that I've placed on the bottom of this slide. So this is a resource issued by the Department of Commerce. And while it's not the most updated resource, on it, you can see that any particular country of origin and what are the AD and CVD cases that are applicable. So, in the screenshot there, we have Chile highlighted, and you can see that there's one case, which is, the preserved mushrooms case that I talked about before. So all of the countries are present on this, and you could just click them to expand it out. And like Jenny said, we will be sending out this slide if you want to use that resource after the fact. So if you're starting by HTS code, so starting by code, so if this is the case, you would essentially need to bump all of your items' classification codes against an updated flagged listing. So I've embedded the most recent listing in this presentation. And Jenny, if you don't mind, can you open up that listing for us? So you'll have a listing after we look at this today. But if you want a new listing or you need a little bit of help, you can always reach out to csagroup@buckland.com, or you can get a similar listing from programs like Customs Info, or any of your brokers should be able to have. So Jenny has this listing here. And so, there's a tab, for example, on CVD, and there's a tab on ADD, and it will list out, all the specific codes in column B. So if your item has one of those or HTS codes, you will know that it is flagged based on that HTS code for one of them. So I typically like to do this myself in an Access database where I combine the anti-dumping and countervailing duty codes into one table and then bump it against my product lines. That being said, there's many ways to work through this and use this process scope. The biggest and most hardest working issue with this approach is that you're going to have to classify your items. I find that it's something you need based on imports anyways, so it's worth the trouble. But depending on how your organization structure works, that could be the problem. So let's say your product has flagged. So it's had one of those codes that Jenny was highlighting there, or that based on the product type, if you're looking by the country approach, that you are likely covered by one of the the generic descriptions that are listed on the country page. If you flagged, it could also be because your broker emails you and said, "Hey, this most recent import flagged for AD and CVD." If this happens, your best friend in this process would be CBP's web-based search portal. So we've placed a link to this in this slide, but essentially the link works like crossworks for U.S. HTS rulings or country of origin rulings. It's just a similar database structure, and users can search for description, HS code, specific case numbers, or by common terms. So if you flagged based on the HS codes listed, I will then go to this page and kind of search the HTS codes and see, what country of origins they're applicable of, and then go into the specific scopes of those items. So once in this page, the idea is to look for scope or for final determination in order to see if your item applies. So there's a column on this page, which I've highlighted on the slide, which has the ACE, it has the coding that's used in ACE, but you're going to want to look for final determination or scope documents. And once you have these documents, you can open them up and review them for the specifics on each case. So once you have, the final determination, it becomes your job to determine if the case relating to your product is something that your product falls under. It's your job to then determine if you fall under that scope. So like classification itself, this will require specifications and or additional information provided by our engineering team. In the final order, the scope is typically in the item defined as number 2, if you're looking through the final order documents. However, just because you find the scope in the documents itself, it does not necessarily mean that determining whether you apply is going to be easy. So one of the juggernaut anti-dumping cases that most of us have probably heard of is cases on aluminum extrusions. So if you pull up the criteria for aluminum extrusions, you can see, that the criteria itself, is 2 pages single spaced and about 1,200 words. So that's what determines on what limit exclusions would qualify. The trick when you're looking through these documents is systematic brute force. So it's systematically working through the definitions laid out. So typically there will be definitions on material of composition, there'll be dimension definitions, and other specific things that you will want to know about your product to attempt to rule it out. So one thing I want to caution when you're doing this is please do not look at the first definition listed in the scope document, say your item doesn't apply, and then stop the process. So in the example of, the long example of extrusions listed, the first definition laid out would be alloy number 1. So alloy number 1 for aluminum is at least 99% aluminum by weight. If you stopped reading the definitions and stopped reading the scope at that point, because you only have 98% aluminum and 2% magnesium, you would miss the later call out saying that, aluminum alloy number 3, aka the one I just described, is also covered under this scope. So make sure to systematically work through the scope ends of the documents to see if they apply. So if you've read through the scope order and you've had 10 or 11 instances of breathing a sigh of relief every time you realize that your product doesn't fit the specific definition laid out, then you're likely in the clear. Once you've gone through it and you can determine that you do not apply for any of those specific cases, you know that you do not apply for that case. So that is one key point you want to look through and you want to say, hey, I apply or I don't apply. But it's equally important to document your notation on why your item does not apply. So sometimes this is easy. Sometimes, if you have a ruling for seamless copper tubing and your tubing's welded or it's made of steel, etc., it's going to be a simple elimination process. But if your item is excluded from, definition number 1 because its carbon content is 0.1 outside of the criteria, and you're excluded from criterion B because your diameter is 1 inch smaller than that criterion, and if you are excluded from criteria C because of some shape minute changes, it's important to know why you do or do not apply to each of the criteria bases, because if customs ever comes inquiring, you want to make sure that you had that documented, and so you can quickly turn around and give it to them. These, scope or process workings is also important because it proves you have a robust program in place. If you can pull up any of your items and say, hey, this doesn't apply because of X, Y, and Z factors, even if there was a mistake made in one of those determinations, which obviously we would not want, but even if there is a mistake made in those determinations, you can prove that it's, it was a mistake and that you have a process in place, and they'll be much more lenient with you. I also want to note that just because you've worked through something and it doesn't apply today, doesn't mean it's not ever going to apply. These cases are updated periodically. And so, you're going to want to keep your notes and audit trail in place. So if the case has changed, you can quickly make sure that it's the same criteria in place and you likewise don't apply. Or if they change, you want to, know what's changed about that criteria to see if you're under scope. So at the end of the day, you've looked through and multiple things or one thing in the scope orders tell you that your item is applicable. It's time, the last chance, the last ditch effort would be to look at supplier applicability. So while countervailing duties cases are typically countrywide, ADD cases focus on specific offending suppliers. So be sure to read the whole order to see if your supplier is covered. And additionally, sometimes, different suppliers are given different duty rates for, the anti-dumping duties. So read through and see if, your supplier is covered. At the end of the day, if you do, you do need to pay, it's time to work on that submission to CBP. So this would be the time that you or an officer needs to work on a certificate of non-reimbursement. So you can pull these in advance and send them to your broker. And there's quite a few different options of how these are pulled. You can pull these as one-time options, blanket options, or you can file them in ACE. But the gist is that these forms essentially document that your items fall within the scope of specific cases. They identify the cases involved, they document your supplier, and they ask you as the importer to confirm that you will not be receiving any reimbursement or any kickbacks from the supplier or any other third party for buying and importing this item. Essentially, it's guaranteeing that this item applies, you reviewed it, you know it applies, and no one else is going to give you a kickback for buying an item that had AD&T covered. One thing I want to note here is that a company officer is actually responsible for authorizing these forms. So this is not something that your broker or your service provider can do on your behalf. So even if your service provider or broker, looks at these cases and determines that a form is needed for you, someone is going to still need to sign it. An officer of your company will. So, I also talked about kickbacks. So the most obvious example of kickbacks, it would be if, you, company H, import, these screws from company A in China. Once you pay the duty, we'll end up giving you, all the money that you paid in ADD cases as part of our contract. So that would be a kickback. So when you sign a certificate of non-reimbursement, you're saying that your company is not getting any of these kickbacks, and that you essentially have to shoulder the money that's included in this import. One thing I want to note is that if you're submitting these forms in ACE, you no longer actually need a scan of a physical form, but customs can request a physical form at any time. So the best practice would be to have a completed form on hand before liquidation could take place. So in terms of forms itself, I've actually put a link on this slide for CDP's instructions, and the bottom of those instructions lists a blank form that you as an importer could utilize. So now that we've gone through kind of the whole process of how to tell if your items apply, I wanted to focus on a couple of examples. I'll go through two a little bit more detail today. So the first that I wanted to talk about is kind of one of the longest examples that have been going on in recent history is the U.S. and Canadian softwood lumber dispute. So it's the longest trade dispute between the U.S. and Canada in history, and it's essentially caused because most lumber in Canada is owned by the provincial governments, and the government set prices administratively for how much the wood will cost. This is slightly different than how the free market works in the United States, and so this has caused a pretty big dispute. And because it's not done by the free market, the U.S. government has dumping in place here. Additionally, another real life example would be the aluminum extrusions that I talked about before. So this started in 2010, and this covers a whopping 125 HTS codes. So, that's why I use it as an example today. Most of us have seen, some type of aluminum extrusions in any of our industries. It covers automotive and manufacturing, even just pipe fittings for, any sorts of uses. So this is one that most of us have seen. So the next question, for me on my end that I would ask is, how do these cases even come about? So, what happens that these cases have happened? So essentially how this works is that, these cases start when a petition is filed by a company or any other interest against an importing party or against a country in general. So when I say any other interest, unions or other, labor groups can start and file a petition jointly, or it could be, one company, i.e. Ford Motor Company, who's filing against another company. Once the petition or complaint is made, the preliminary investigations begins. So in this, there's two government agencies that are involved, which is Department of Commerce and the USITC. So Commerce in this process reviews the petitions to see if there is any indication that the items are being dumped or subsidized. And they get about 140 days for dumping and 60 days for countervailing duties, but they can request extensions if their investigation is ongoing. So in this preliminary phase, the USITC determines that sees if there is reasonable indication that the industry has been damaged. So not only, does there need to be dumping or does there need to be, some type of assistance that would result in countervailing duties, but U.S. industry or Canadian industry also has to be damaged by this process. So at this point, if it's determined that there's some preliminary looking like it's going to happen, they'll continue investigating and they'll send out questionnaires. So most of us had suppliers reach out at some point or another that they've been sent questionnaires by the U.S. government. It's extremely important if you ever have a supplier get one of these that you ask the supplier to respond to this questionnaire. If they don't respond, your supplier is definitely going to be included if there's a scope issued on these. In fact, by not responding, in many instances, it hastens about an ADD or CBD case being issued. If they do respond, yes, they could be included within the scope. But like I said earlier, some anti-dumping cases have lower rates for different suppliers, and sometimes specific suppliers are not included at all. So I would say it's best to supply. So, once the preliminary investigations are concluded, if either the USITC's investigation to see if internal industry has been damaged, or Commerce's review to see if something's been dumped or subsidized, if either of those come back negative, then it's closed out, said and done. This isn't going to be an anti-dumping or countervailing duty case. So if the preliminary investigation substantiates the petition, that's when it will be published in the Federal Register, and that's when CBP will actually start to suspend the liquidation of entries on anything that would fall under, what they deem as the descriptions or current HTS codes at that time. And so what this results to is that, Customs will ask for a deposit on these entries as they come in the country. This is oftentimes when, companies start to get scared and concerned. A couple of years ago, we had a case of grouped pulleys coming from China, which hit industry hard. So, the deposit, just because you're being asked for a deposit, does not necessarily mean the case is going to be finalized, but it means that it's possible that it might be, and, there's a chance that you're going to have to pay these duties. After, the preliminary determination, the final investigation begins. This takes about 75 days. There can be extensions. Some have been quicker, some have been longer, but they're supposed to get it done in 75 days or file for an extension. And this is when there's often audits by the U.S. government of foreign producers. So, they'll come to the facility and they'll either audit books or audit processes to see if the cases will apply. So, if it's determined that in this final review that dumping or assistance is taking place, a determination will be made. Basically, depending on the amount of assistance or dumping that's been determined, the amount of the duties that the cases order will change. So if very little assistance is done, it'll be a lesser extent, but if there's quite a bit of assistance being offered, the countervailing duty will be higher. And so once determined and is active, there are periodic reviews of these cases. Essentially, they'll periodically look at the information on hand again and say, would U.S. industry still be hurt by this? And is dumping and or subsidizing still taking place? So the next question is kind of, how can we help you? We tried to go through this process today so you can look and you can see, the general notes about how anti-dumping happens, how these cases come about, how you can roll out your products. At the end of the day, I realize that it's a large and intense problem. If that's something that you have specific questions, you need single verifications or you need verification programs, please reach out to Buckland, to CSA Group, or to me personally, and we are more than happy to help. It's a complicated project out there, especially when some of these are so intense and in depth in terms of definitions.
That's the Beyond Borders podcast for today. Thank you so much for listening, and thank you to our guest, Chris Borganis, for the exploration of this very interesting topic. If you're looking for more resources related to international trade, check out buckland.com and click on the Learning section across the top of the website. Here, you'll find a range of resources, including learning guides, webinars, and podcasts. Our downloadable learning guides include Incoterms charts, common trade terminology, how to avoid border delays, and many more. We also host live monthly webinars, and we invite you to sign up online and secure your spot for an informative presentation followed by a live Q&A session. The best way to keep up to date on all of these resources is through our weekly newsletter. We send out a newsletter every single Wednesday containing the latest resources we have to offer, as well as a roundup of the latest trade news delivered straight to your inbox. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to us through our website's Contact Us page, through Twitter, where our handle is @BucklandTweets, on our LinkedIn company page, or through Instagram @BucklandInsta. Thank you so much for listening to the Beyond Borders podcast, and be sure to tune in again and subscribe for more great conversations about importing, exporting, and everything else in the world of logistics and international trade.